I cannot tell you how many times over the past months I have asked the question, does it seem that there are more bad things happening now than there used to? Or is it just because of the crush of media and social media and the 24-hour news cycle that it seems that way? And it seems that the answer, both I've heard from people and I've thought myself, maybe it's a little of both. It is an amazing thing, though, how a great, great God is so powerful that He can take something which begins with evil and bring about good ends. That is how powerful He is. I came across this past week praying a prayer, Lord, let the light of the gospel shine, where Irma came and Harvey came and Marie came. Lord, let the light of the gospel shine where an earthquake hit, where a shooter killed and murdered people, where a shooter broke into a church just a couple of weeks ago in Tennessee. Lord, let the light of the gospel shine in these places. And I came across an article this past week titled, Las Vegas Churches Unite to Help the Hurting in the Wake of a Massacre. I must admit, when I think Las Vegas, I don't think of church. But many of you may not know there are some great churches in Las Vegas. I want to read to you an article. It's a little lengthy, but I think it's important to share. It says, Las Vegas may be experiencing its darkest hour, but churches in the city Monday, just this past Monday, expressed hope around the opportunity for ministry after the deadliest mass shooting in modern U.S. history. Vance Pittman pastors a church. I follow him on Twitter. He has some great messages. He does a blog. He does kind of a podcast. I follow some of his stuff and has a great church. He is the pastor of Hope Church in Las Vegas. He says there is an incredible spirit of kingdom collaboration. We're just all in it together. Senior pastor Paul Mark Goulet of the International Church of Las Vegas said, it's been beautiful to see churches responding in unity. It doesn't matter the denomination, whether it's bringing food or going into the hospital, everyone's rallying and pulling together, he told CBN News. Goulet and Associate Pastor Pasquale Urabazzo attended early morning meetings Monday with pastors around the city to plan their response strategy. They are also coordinating their efforts with Las Vegas police and the city council. Area churches have a track record of partnering with police, so the relationships were already in place to coordinate a response after Sunday night's attack, they said. Las Vegas churches sent teams of pastors and lay volunteers to meet with shooting victims and their families, both in hospitals, at the Thomas and Mack Center, where authorities transported many concert goers after the shooting. Many churches are also providing transportation to concert goers from out of town who missed their flights home. Churches encourage members to give blood. It's said that the churches showed up so much at the blood banks that they had to send some of them home and tell them to come back next week. At least two churches, Hope Church and Shadow Hills Church, are working with the local blood banks to use their facilities. In addition, many churches are opening their sanctuaries for prayer, and 3 will hold prayer meetings. Central Church in Henderson opened a prayer hotline for the public, and International Church is mobilizing a counseling hotline for those affected by the attack. Now listen to this. I love this. Listen very closely. The trauma is just massive, said Goulet. You think of the 50 plus that were killed, the 500 now that are at the hospital. Then there were thousands more severely impacted. And Goulet said this, one casino called and asked for counselors for their employees. Pittman said his church also sent counselors to the Mandalay Bay Resort and Casino at its request. Pause for just a moment. And I prayed, God, if something like this happened in Warner Robins, I don't care if it's the bar rooms or the strip clubs or the seediest clubs around, I pray that they would feel like they could contact us for help. Pittman described Las Vegas as an incredibly lost city, but he said he's encouraged to see how the Lord is working. He said a lot of people are asking the question, where's God in all this in a sinful city? And he said Las Vegas is known as Sin City, but where sin abounds, grace all the more. Sometimes what appears to be a smashed set of circumstances can actually be a platform for God working out new life and new opportunities. Now, in the face of it, it's awfully challenging. It's awfully hurtful. It's sad and it's scary. I don't know about you, but natural disasters, tornadoes, hurricanes, earthquakes, those can be scary. But there's something particularly traumatic about an individual intentionally going after people and murdering mass numbers. There's just something particularly disturbing about that. And so there's nothing good about it, and yet in the face of it, we serve a God who is so sovereign, listen, that adversity can actually provide opportunity to spread the seed of the gospel to others. I prayed, God, if something, God forbid something so horrible should happen in this area, but if it did, God, that we would be the kind of church that would be out sharing the gospel instead of huddling behind closed doors in fear. Let me ask you a question. What types of trials might be used to spread the gospel? Adversity evangelism. Acts chapter 8. If you have your Bibles with you, I want to take a look at a topic we're going to call adversity evangelism. It is just simply the next passage we're studying in the book of Acts. Acts chapter 8. It is the next passage on the tail end of something that would have been particularly traumatic to that first church. You think trauma is new to our culture? What about one Sunday I'm preaching and we're sharing the gospel and a group of people burst in the door and grab me or grab Pastor Mike or grab one of our men who teach Sunday school or our deacons. And what if they broke in this group and they drugged them out in the road and murdered them out in the middle of the street? That is what happened to Stephen in Acts chapter 7. That is exactly what happened to him. That is no embellishment. He was the first martyr. He was murdered brutally in the street by a mob of people who stoned him to death for preaching the gospel. What if that happened? I got to be honest with you, with all the horrible things that have happened in the world, that would be right up there with them if that were to happen in a church. So what do you do after that takes place? Acts chapter 8, it would seem that in Jerusalem, which is where Stephen was murdered, things get worse. And yet in Acts chapter 8, as we study, as things get worse, the gospel spreads more. It's a great dichotomy. You would think as the Christians are attacked, you would think as death is brought upon them that they would withdraw, and yet it seems, as one great preacher of old said, the blood of the saints is the seed of the gospel. The blood of Christian martyrs seems to be the seed of the gospel. It seems at times that the gospel flourishes more in adversity than it does in prosperity. What are some situations? What are some trials that might be used to spread the gospel? Acts chapter 8, Stephen has just been murdered. We pick up in verse 1 to consider some of the trials that God might use in our lives. Can I say that while horrible things were happening in Las Vegas and in Puerto Rico and in Mexico City and even a few weeks ago in Florida and Houston, horrible things were happening, that doesn't change the fact that there are some really tough things that have happened in some of your lives just this week. Maybe it's financial, maybe it's relational, maybe it's a health issue. But some of you are pondering things in your mind that have happened last week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks, and it's a very difficult time for you personally. It's not something you would compare to a mass shooting in Las Vegas. Okay, maybe it's not to that extent, but it's your trial. It's what you're having to deal with. You might even look around and say, you know, Pastor, I know people in this church that are facing worse things than I am. And that may be true, but the thing you're facing is your thing. And so you're sitting here today facing adversity, and I hope that by the time you leave here, you can be encouraged to say, you know what, as difficult as this situation is, how might God use it to spread the gospel? What are some trials where that might happen? Verse 1 of chapter 8, now Saul, our friendly neighborhood terrorist, who would become an apostle. A man who thought that killing Christians was God's will. A man who pursued Christians, and we'll see more in just a minute, some of the horrible things he did. Now, Saul was consenting to his death, Stephen's death. That word consenting, if you're not careful, you might think it's just that Saul agreed with it, that Saul was standing to the side and going, yeah, cheering them on. But let me give you a little bit broader perspective of this. That word consenting means a hearty agreement. But it means more than that because of who Saul was. If this were just any citizen, then it might just be one going, yeah, go get Stephen, go get him for sharing all that error and all those lies. See, Saul was one of the greatest upcoming preachers and leaders of his entire area in Cilicia. And Saul was the one back in Acts chapter 6 who debated Stephen. Remember, we learned that because Saul was from Cilicia and because Saul was the lead debater and because someone from Cilicia debated Stephen, it had to be Saul. It was Stephen and Saul, no holds bar, cage match debate. And Stephen won the debate. And Saul was not a guy who was accustomed to losing debates. And so rather than going and preparing himself, rather than pondering truth, he did what many do. He cheated. He got so mad at Stephen for beating him in a debate, he got the crowd worked up, and he led the execution of Stephen. Now, according to the text, it doesn't appear as if Saul actually threw any of the rocks. He held the coats. But if you ever watched any of these movies that talk about organized crime, and you'll hear them say, who gave the order to bring the hit on so-and-so? Who gave the order to kill so-and-so? That top guy will never actually be the one who pulls the trigger, but he's the one that made it happen. That's Saul. Saul's not the guy who threw the rocks. He's the lead guy who got people under him to throw the rocks. He gave the order. He could have stopped it, but he didn't. At that time, a great persecution arose against the church, which was at Jerusalem. And so at this point, remember, the church is still all concentrated in Jerusalem. All the believers, tens of thousands by this point, in a city that was only about 300,000. And so it would be comparable to within a 4 or 5 week period that 7,000 or 8,000 people all of a sudden get saved in Warner Robins. I mean, it'd be comparable. That's a large number of people. Or that 10,000 get saved in Houston County. It's 10% of the population had most likely gotten saved there in Jerusalem. And so there's this large group of people, 20, 25, 30,000 people who are now Christians. And a great persecution arises against them in Jerusalem, and they were scattered. Now, if you go back, and we won't turn there, but in Acts chapter 1, verse 8, Jesus said, this is kind of my plan for missions. You're going to be my witnesses. And you'll be my witnesses starting in Jerusalem. Then you'll move out into Judea and Samaria, and then into the uttermost. Jesus gave a three-pronged mission strategy. Start in Jerusalem, work your way out from there, and then go into the uttermost, which is still true today, by the way. If we won't share the gospel across the street, it's doubtful getting a team together and sending them across the ocean is going to cause us to share the gospel anymore. If you won't share the gospel right here in where you live with your neighbors, where you work, right where you live, the idea of then going off on a mission trip to a foreign country is not really that great of an idea. I like what one preacher that I was listening to this past week said, geography has never determined what's in your heart. And if you're sharing the gospel where you are, and then if you go overseas, you'll share the gospel there too. And so what we see here is in verse 1, these believers were scattering. They were scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, which, by the way, is the second part of Christ's missions movement. They were scattered about the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. In other words, the apostles were the leaders. They were going to kind of stay with the ship. They stayed in Jerusalem. They were putting themselves in grave danger. But they felt like they had to stay there to kind of keep the church together. These guys were putting themselves on the line while everybody else, they were getting everybody else out of town. I would suspect, it would not surprise me if they weren't going around helping families to get out, finding out where families needed to go, help them to get out of town, helping to protect them as they went. That word, by the way, in verse 1, scattered, diaspora. There is an English word, diaspora. We refer to the spreading of the gospel of the church as the church moves out, the diaspora age where the gospel really spread. And that word means to scatter, sporos, throughout. To scatter throughout. And it was often used as an agricultural term to scatter seed. See, God had a big bunch of seed in Jerusalem. It's like, okay, we need to get the gospel outside of Jerusalem. But I don't know about you, but if you go back and look at some of the commentary about the church in Jerusalem in Acts chapter 2 and Acts chapter 3 and 4, it seemed like a great time. Man, they were gathering together. They were praying together. There was fellowship. There was family. It was growing. Man, they were excited. Why would they want to leave Jerusalem? I mean, it's like going to a youth camp. It's like going to a retreat. You know how it is. You get there at those retreats, and man, the preaching's there, and you're in the Word every day, and you're with people in fellowship. It's kind of like, man, I don't know that I want to leave. But you've got to go back home to take what you learned at the retreat or at the camp to take it back, the gospel back to the house. I know even in youth camp oftentimes, students are like, man, I don't even know if I want to go home. It's been so great here at youth camp. But you've got to. And so that's what was happening in Jerusalem. God said, we've got to scatter the gospel outside of Jerusalem. How will we do that? We'll start with a man dying for his faith. That, by the way, would embolden Christians, not strike fear in their hearts. If Stephen had run, if Stephen had compromised, if Stephen had moved out of the way or not told the truth, it would have hurt the movement. But instead, he emboldened them. And these folks were running out of town. They'd run home, grab a few clothes, throw it in a suitcase, and take off. They're not hooking up moving vans, pulling it in front of the house and spending a day loading up and pulling out. They're grabbing what they could and going out of the house. I can see fathers carrying children on their shoulder and mamas, kids in their hand and running out of town. But as they go, we're going to see they're preaching the gospel. One of the things that God might use to spread the gospel in my life, one of the trials, is what we might call the trial of hatred toward me. I mean, you might be in a situation where people are against you, even for your faith. Maybe at work, you're trying to follow all the rules because you want to honor the Lord, and there's a whole other group that don't want to follow the rules because it would make it easier. And so guess what? They don't like you because you're making them look bad. But all you're trying to do is honor the Lord with your work. Could it be that in their anger towards you that God could ultimately bring about a sharing of the gospel? Absolutely. A trial of hatred toward me. Could it be that you're in a situation where people don't know you or don't like you, don't have any friends, you're alone, and yet walking out? Could it be that in that situation God could actually share the gospel? There was precise, intentional hatred being carried out toward the believers in chapter 8. Here's my thought. What a better time to spread the gospel than when people are spewing hatred toward me. I mean, if you're living out the gospel when people are spewing hatred toward you, then how can they not believe that? I mean, if all you can do is share the gospel when everybody loves you, well, anybody can do that. What happens when people don't like you so much? There was an archaeological dig, a story that I came across, an archaeological dig in the remains of a Roman city. And in this Roman city, there was a school for imperial pages. And in an archaeological dig, there was excavated a picture that dates from the 3rd century. Shows a boy in this picture, his hand raised, worshiping a figure on a cross. Guess what that boy was? Except it's the head of a boy, but the body of a donkey. Scrawled on the writing, or scrawled on it is the writing, Alexamenos worships his God. Nearby in a second inscription, it's written, Alexamenos is faithful. Apparently, a young man had a picture drawn about him and was made fun of for sharing his faith in the 3rd century in the Roman Empire. If I can only share the gospel when people agree with me or they love me, then what is that? Am I only able to share the gospel when everyone agrees with me and everyone's patting me on the back? Sometimes we have young people who come forward to trust Christ as their Savior and they're baptized. And look, I get it. The church folk come by and I'm so proud of you and hug them and love them. But here's the question. When you walk back into the school, when you walk back into the game, when you walk back into the crowd, and nobody really cares if you trusted Christ. In fact, nobody really is interested. Then what do you do? You come forward to serve in the context of the church body and the fellowship, Sunday morning, serving in the nursery, Sunday morning, serving in Sunday school, or throughout the week serving in other ways, and then you go into a workplace where there are no other Christians. So you got to ask the question, when there are people around me who aren't interested, who may not even like Christ or the Christian faith, am I going to be able to share my faith just as much as I did when everybody loved me? I'll tell you this, believers shine the brightest when they are in the darkest of hatred. A believer will witness most loudly when there's the sharing of the gospel in the midst of the noise of hatred. So there could be a trial of hatred toward me. Acts chapter 8, verse 2. And devout men carried Stephen to his burial and made great lamentation over him. I'm going to pause there for just a second. Devout men, for a long time, I just saw devout men and I thought of Christians. Now remember, this is in Jerusalem. And remember, Christians are being persecuted. They're being killed and thrown in jail. They're running. Stephen's body is in Jerusalem. If Christians had come to carry his body off, they probably wouldn't have got 10 feet with him before they'd been grabbed and thrown in jail or worse, killed. So it says here there are devout men. All through the book of Acts, Christians are called disciples. Later they're called Christians. I'm not convinced as Acts chapter 8 verse 2, the devout men, I'm not convinced those are Christians. In fact, I'm more convinced those are devout Jews. I'm convinced these are devout Jews who maybe in their minds thought this is wrong. This is so wrong for us to have killed Stephen. If you go back a couple of chapters, remember the great Jewish teacher Gamaliel? Gamaliel stood up when Peter and John were arrested and said, hey guys, you need to leave Peter and John alone because number one, if they're working for the Lord, then you'll be fighting against God. But number two, if they're not working for the Lord, their cause will dissipate and be gone. Remember Gamaliel, he stopped them from attacking Peter and John. Could it be that these devout men were actually students of Gamaliel? By the way, we'll find this out as we go along. Saul's primary teacher was Gamaliel. Saul is a rogue student. Saul's leading people to kill Christians. Saul's gone rogue on Gamaliel. He at this point, maybe he believes he knows more than Gamaliel, his great teacher. But Gamaliel was a Jewish rabbi and he had students under him. And I'm convinced these men who believed it was wrong to have murdered Stephen took the body of him. And by the way, it was against the law to have an open funeral and grieving, open weeping for an executed criminal, which they would have seen Stephen, by the way. And so these men not only took Stephen's body, they violated the law, maybe sort of a protest. Dr. John MacArthur, this week I was listening to a message of his on this passage, and he made that statement. He said, I believe they were carrying this body to burial in protest of what had been done. You never know who God's going to use to come to your aid, your side. And so in Acts chapter 8, verse 2, we see some men carrying the body off. Stephen, by the way, Stephen's name means crown. He was kind of the crowning martyr, if you will, to begin the Christian age, the first martyr. And as for Saul, verse 3, well, he made havoc of the church. You want to know just how much havoc? Let me give you a few passages. Just write these down if you want to follow up. Acts 22, verses 3 through 4. Acts 26, verses 9 through 11. Galatians chapter 1, verses 13 through 14. Those are only 3 of the 6 places where either Paul or others talk about how he destroyed Christians. And by the way, Stephen is not the only Christian that Saul helped to kill. He acknowledges later in the book of Acts that the Christians he helped to kill were plural, not singular, not just Stephen. The Christians he helped to put in jail were plural. I fear we may underestimate the kind of damage Saul was bringing against the church at the time. And you think we've just begun to experience horrible culture and attacks and bad things? Folks, it's been going on since the beginning of time, since Cain murdered Abel. I mean, what's worse than that? Your older son, or one of your sons murders the other. That's pretty bad. It's the human heart. It's a sin issue. It's not a cultural issue. It's not a race issue. It's not a religious issue. It's not a political issue. It is a sin issue. And my desire is to see the church stand up with one voice. Black and white, Hispanic, Latino, Asian, tall, short, big, small. Stand up with one voice and say, we have an answer. If you're interested, we have an answer. So verse 3, as for Saul, he made havoc of the church, entering every house. Three things he did here: entering every house, dragging off men and women, committing them to prison. This is the enemy at work, and by the way, the enemy kind of still works this way. Entering every house, the enemy is still attacking our homes. Let me just be very clear. One of the great crises in our culture, in all kinds of places, is the absence of fathers. Make no mistake about it. Families falling apart. That is epidemic in our culture. And there are few political problems that you could go to and somehow, some way couldn't see families falling apart and absentee fathers as a root of the problem. I'm not being simplistic, folks. I don't have time to explain all the different political issues, how these things are tied together at this moment. But I'm convinced that the absence of fathers and families falling apart, the enemy still attacks our homes. It says dragging off men and women. He still drags off men and women. Families falling apart. I read an article this past week about women who cheat on their husbands. And it said over the last 25 years, the percentage of men who cheat on their wives has remained relatively stable, but the percentage of women cheating on their husbands has grown almost 200%. And there are all these reasons why. And there were anonymous women interviewed for the article who basically said they felt more in tune after having had an adulterous relationship. That they felt that they had something on their own. They felt they had something for themselves. Folks, I'm telling you, the enemy is still dragging off men and women. Still doing it today. And he's still throwing people in jail. Pastor, what do you mean? Just bondage. It could be bondage to work, or bondage to drugs, or bondage to alcohol, or bondage to sex, or you name it. There are families in bondage to that stuff today. Unforgiveness and bitterness. Back here in Acts chapter 8, their friend, one of their leaders, had died. Now, not only had Stephen died, but they're watching families, next door neighbors, people who they care about, drug off to prison. Some killed. There was plenty of heartbreak around them, folks. Don't think heartbreak is something new to us. Don't think we have a monopoly in 2017 on heartbreak. What a better time to communicate the love of Christ. Back in May of 2005, it's been now 12 years ago, my sister, who was 37 years old, died of lung cancer. And she was living up in East Tennessee, which is where she was buried. She was buried in kind of a family cemetery where a lot of my family members are buried. My dad's buried, their grandparents. And when I got there for the funeral, it was my sister. And I was sad, and I wept at times, and it was heartbreaking. But I would have had no one else preach her funeral but me. And so I was able to take one of the accounts then. I remember I took one of the accounts of Jesus in the Gospels, and I clearly preached the message of salvation. I knew there were unbelievers there. Some were her friends, some were family members. I knew there were unbelievers. And I had someone later say, I just don't see how you could preach her funeral. I don't think I could have done it. And my answer was, with the opportunity here, how could I not? It's no great heroic thing. It's just, how could I not? The late Reverend E.V. Hill. If you've never heard the sermon When God Was at His Best, go on YouTube and look at Reverend E.V. Hill. Great preacher from California. He's passed now. And listen to his sermon When God Was at His Best. Reverend E.V. Hill, he pastored Mount Zion Missionary Baptist Church in Los Angeles, California, when he preached the sermon I was telling you about. But in 2003, he passed away. However, not long, some years prior to that, his wife, who he deeply loved, had passed away. And he preached her funeral, E.V. Hill did. And this is what he said. He said, some might ask, how can I do that? My response, if God is God when our hearts are broken, how much more believable is our gospel to the world? The trial of heartbreak. When I'm walking in heartbreak, if I can only be true to the gospel when things are great, if I can only have joy and peace and patience and kindness and goodness and meekness and self-control when things are great, folks, lost people can do that. But when things are bad, if someone who's lost is looking at me and I fall apart, and they're saying, well, that faith you talk about, it's no better than you can't deal with trouble any better than I can. I'll just stick with my lostness. And then verses 4 through 8. Therefore, those who were scattered, that word scattered the seed. By the way, this is a passive verb, which means that the object of the verb is being acted upon. Who's the object? Those. Those being scattered, the Christians. The Christians were being acted upon. They weren't scattering themselves. They were being scattered as if God said, okay, I've got to get the gospel seed out beyond Jerusalem. And so I'm going to use a very difficult time to scatter the seed of the gospel. And everywhere those who are scattered preach the word. I love that. That word preach, by the way, there are 3 different words for preach in the New Testament, 3 different Greek words. There is karuzo, to declare. There is didasko, which means to teach or instruct. And then there is euangelizo, which we get the English word evangelize from that. That's the word used here, evangelize. The people, as they scattered, as they ran for their lives, they evangelized. Don't you love that? Oh, Pastor, I don't know how you can ask me to share my faith now. Things are going so bad and so crazy. I can't even think about that. Well, that's funny because these Christians were running for their lives, and that seems to be a lot of what they thought about. Then Philip. You can check out Philip back in Acts chapter 6. He was one of the 7 chosen. Later on in Acts chapter 21, Philip is called an evangelist. By the way, he's the only one in the book of Acts who actually is given the title evangelist. And then he had 2 daughters who were prophets, which certainly is a departure from what we normally see in the New Testament, but it says it in Acts chapter 21. Philip went down to the city of Samaria and preached Christ to them. Samaria is actually north of Jerusalem. But for those who have been to the Holy Land, you know Jerusalem, if you go anywhere, it's down. Jerusalem kind of sits up on a shelf, if you will. So whether you go north or south, east or west, you're going down. Well, Philip went north, but he went down the mountain from Jerusalem to Samaria and preached Christ to them. Samaria was a city the Jews thought was unclean. It was full of those who were Gentiles and Jews intermarried. Samaria, listen, Samaria was full of interracial marriages. Ick, right? That's what the Jews thought. It's interesting, that's the first place, one of the first places God sent the gospel beyond Jerusalem. I'm going to send him to the city that the Jews think is the most unclean, and we're going to see people won to Jesus there. It just simply doesn't matter where you're from or what you look like or where you've been. Philip preaches the gospel in Samaria. And the multitude with one accord, verse 6, heeded the things spoken by Philip, hearing and seeing the miracles which he did. And so Philip was one of those who was allowed to perform miracles to validate the gospel. Philip, Stephen, and the apostles, by and large, were those who performed miracles in the book of Acts. Sometimes we look on TV, and I was talking this morning in Sunday school about some of those we see on TV, guys running around talking about performing miracles. I'll be honest with you, it was really a very small number of people in the Scriptures who actually did this, and they did it in order to validate the gospel. They did it in places where the gospel had never been preached. So as they preached, and then people saw, well, how do we know this is true? They validated the gospel with the miracles. Verse 7, for unclean spirits, crying with a loud voice, came out of many who were possessed, and many who were paralyzed, and lame were healed. Verse 7, folks, it's craziness. Demon-filled people, which I believe, by the way, still exists. Maybe not to the degree we see in Acts, still exists. People empowered and enabled by demons. They don't always look crazy. Sometimes they have a suit on. But I'm just saying it still happens today. And demons were being cast out, and it was almost havoc. And in the midst of it all, look at verse 8, and there was great joy in that city. The horror that took place in Jerusalem led to joy in Samaria. The heartbreak that took place in the church in Jerusalem led to celebration in Samaria. Only our God could take the heartbreak of one and bring about joy for others. Only our God has the power to take what I'm going to call the trial of havoc around me and bring order. Folks, adversity can provide an opportunity to spread the seed of the gospel to others. I came across another article last week. It's actually several weeks old. The title, The Best Kept Secret in Disaster Relief. Harvey in Houston, Irma up through Florida and into Georgia, Marie in Puerto Rico, earthquake in Mexico City. You name a disaster that's taken place in the United States of America, and disaster relief teams go there. And this article is called The Best Kept Secret in Disaster Relief. It's talking about, it's talking about Southern Baptist disaster relief teams. You know, Green Acres is a Southern Baptist church. I don't know how many of you know this. We give through something called the cooperative program. And all the Southern Baptist churches all give, and it's put a pool of money, and that pool of money is then used for everything from seminaries to ministries to local ministries to North American ministry to international ministry. But one of the major areas that is utilized in this money and this funding is through disaster relief teams. We are, Green Acres Baptist Church, is a part of an association called the Rehoboth Baptist Association. The Rehoboth Baptist Association has its own disaster relief team. And when disasters happen, they're gone. From time to time, on our anniversary celebration, we've used their tent. For our Camp Windshape, at times we've used their tent. And this is always the caveat. The gentleman, Ronnie Clements, that runs the local disaster relief team says, here's the caveat. Well, you're welcome to use the tent, but if a disaster happens, we may have to show up one evening and pull that tent up and take off, and you get there the next morning, it's gone. Because disasters always take the priority. And our own disaster relief team can feed 1,500 meals a day. I heard that one time, and I went back to Ronnie, I said, is this right? In fact, in the article I read, it said about 90% of all meals that are provided in the last probably decade in America of disaster situations under Red Cross and Salvation Army have been provided by the Southern Baptist Disaster Relief Teams. It said that the Southern Baptists have the third largest disaster relief organization in America. And a lot of times when you see the Red Cross operating in disaster relief areas, it's actually Southern Baptists, but they have to operate up under the Red Cross. And oh yeah, make no mistake, they take the gospel with them wherever they go. Adversity can provide an opportunity to spread the seed of the gospel to others. Listen, folks, I don't know what you're facing right now in your life. And I know it seems probably really bad to you, and I'm sure it is. Whatever disappointment, whatever heartbreak, but I'm telling you, God can use it to spread the gospel. And I'm just wondering, are you available to be used? Do you know Christ is your Savior in such a way that you could actually turn around and share it with somebody else? Well, Pastor, I'm no preacher. I didn't say that. I didn't say you were a Sunday school teacher. I'm just saying, are you in a place, have you been born again? Do you know Christ as your Savior? Where if all you could do is take a gospel tract to someone around you and hand it to them so at least they can read it and it can share the gospel. Maybe it is. I'm wondering. How many of you here today would say, Pastor, as the opportunity arises, I'm prepared to be able to explain the gospel to someone else? I mean, I could take it, I could explain to them how to be saved. And I'm wondering, is there anyone here who would say, Pastor, I don't think I'm fully prepared to do that? If you're not, can I suggest to you that here in just a moment, as we start the invitation, you come forward and say, Pastor, I want some training on how to share the gospel. We've got someone who can do that for you, who's waiting to be able to do it. Maybe you would just say, Pastor, I want to know how to be saved myself. Or maybe it is that just your heart's broken over something that's happened in your life over the past week or 2 weeks or a month. And you just need to come and pray, or maybe pray with someone. Come let me know. We'll let you sit down with someone who can pray with you and encourage you along the way. I'm going to pray, and then we're going to stand, and you're going to respond as the Lord leads. Father, right now in Jesus' name, help us to obey you without hesitation. Jesus, we love you. We thank you for this opportunity right now. Why don't you stand right where you are?